One top Republican we have yet to mention is Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. It seems like he's almost, hanging back, letting this play out with Kevin McCarthy. Where is he in terms of these negotiations?
So McConnell, he is no stranger to kind of debt ceiling negotiations. He was the one who worked with then Vice President Joe Biden in 2011 to kind of come up with an out on the debt ceiling, and he's negotiated before. But McConnell, he doesn't need to prove his leadership bona fides, unlike McCarthy. And as he's noted, something that passes the Senate, the Democratic-controlled Senate, doesn't necessarily have the votes to pass the House. So he's strategically staying in the background. He is letting McCarthy kind of take the lead here in the first round of negotiations. He's supporting him, and many Senate Republicans are supporting the position that McCarthy has. But if McCarthy and Biden, or McCarthy or Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer are able to reach a deal, then you'll start to see McConnell stick his oar in the water. McConnell is very much a fiscal conservative. He is intent on seeing some sort of cuts to spending. Count him as someone who's probably in favor of entitlement reforms, but he's also not in favor of default. He's made that crystal clear that the country will not default. And so if it comes to kind of the end stages and we're nearing the X date and McCarthy can't reach a deal, expect that the McConnell will be a bit more active and a bit more vocal in trying to reach a deal. And even if he does try to reach a deal, he's still going to try to drive a hard bargain here. And it requires some sort of concessions from Democrats. But if he gets involved in the deal, there's some sense that you can believe that he can bring at least 9 Republicans along in the Senate that can overcome the filibuster. And if something then passes in the Senate, then there's some thought that if it's at least closer to the X date and there's real panic, that there's some way to get something through the House.
What would these concessions look like if push comes to shove and McConnell comes to negotiate? What would that look like?
Yeah, so it's the country and Republicans and Democrats are much different than a decade ago, or more than a decade ago, when in 2011 there was a lot of negotiations over spending cuts of some sort of entitlement reforms. This day and age, you see Republicans a bit more populist, and that you saw former President Donald Trump and some populist Republicans saying, no, we're not going to cut entitlement spending. We're not going to cut Social Security. We're not going to cut Medicare. These are some of the biggest drivers of debt. So they're more focused on kind of discretionary spending, but even that is limited. And so Democrats from a decade ago are just less willing to negotiate. And so they've learned that negotiating did not result in anything beneficial for them politically, and it just kind of hampered government spending for kind of the following decade. So what could come out of negotiations this time? It's very much kind of a lot of fig leaf options. And what I mean by that is that something like a bipartisan commission. There's something introduced by Mitt Romney and several Democrats in the Senate, as well as in representatives in the House, something called the Trust Act, which would create bipartisan committees to look at some of these trust funds and this entitlement spending, looking to kind of create solvency for these programs over the long term. And that's the thing with entitlement reforms. You can't do this partisan. You have to do this bipartisan, so they have sign on for both people. But a blue ribbon committee or bipartisan committee usually doesn't necessarily result in action, but it kind of punts the issue to a committee. So that's one option. Another option is some piecemeal or some very focused spending cuts. So we've seen some Republicans talk about rescinding unspent and unobligated COVID aid from the pandemic. There's been trillions and trillions of dollars spent during the pandemic, and there's about $150 billion that's been unspent and unobligated. And so that could be a little pool of money that could be rescinded and say, okay, that's some sort of deficit reduction. And then what Republicans are looking for is some sort of spending caps deal. And that means just on discretionary spending, limiting kind of the growth in spending for the next 2 years. Now, they're saying they want to limit discretionary spending, but a lot of Republicans are against a decrease in defense spending, especially with a more hawkish view towards China and with the kind of the war in Ukraine and the concerns about Russia. And so there may be some avenue for lowering spending or some very targeted spending on the discretionary side, but it's nothing that's going to really make a dent in the trajectory of debt. And so I think these are all options that are on the table, that nothing that would necessarily satisfy the far right, but it's not about satisfying them today. It's about kind of negotiations ongoing in the future and being able to declare victory that they got some sort of concession out of the debt ceiling.